Hi there. Welcome to Aunt Angel's Reading Room, and a big shout out to my favorite bear, Miss Mandy May. Today we're going to start a new poem, another one by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and the name of this poem is called The Courtship of Miles Standish. Now, the reason I said we're going to start this new poem is because it's really long. It's a narrative poem. Narrative poems are poems that tell stories. But epic poems are also poems that tell stories, but they're extra long and they have sections. Normally, an epic poem is a little bit longer than this one, but Mr. Longfellow wanted us to feel like this was an epic poem. So he took the poem and he divided it into sections, like chapters in a book, and he gave each of the sections titles, like chapter titles. And so we'll read them just like we would read chapters in a book. We'll read a different section with each video, okay? Now, this poem is about the early days of America, right after the Pilgrims came. And you remember that the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, and a lot of people died on the Mayflower. You may not know that. And then the Pilgrims survived a really rough winter right after they got to America. And after they survived the really rough winter, quite a few people died in that winter. And so it was a really rough time. But where this poem starts is in the spring, the early spring, right after the winter is over. And the Mayflower is just getting ready to go back to England and tell everybody at home how the first winter in America was. And so that's where our story begins. Now, our story talks about three main people. One is Miles Standish, obviously, because the poem is named for him. One is his best friend, John Alden. And the last person, it's a girl, and her name is Priscilla. And you'll be hearing a lot about her, but not much today. So that's all the explanations we need for today. So without going further, the narrative poem, the epic poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Section 1, the title of it is simply Miles Standish. In the old colony days, in Plymouth, the land of the Pilgrims, to and fro in a room of his simple and primitive dwelling, clad in a doublet and hose, and boots of Cordovan leather, strode with a martial air Miles Standish, the Puritan captain. Buried in thought he seemed, with his hands behind him, and pausing ever and anon, to behold his glittering weapons of warfare, hanging in shining array along the walls of the chamber. Cutlass and corselet of steel, and his trusty sword of Damascus, curved at the point and inscribed with its mystical Arabic sentence, while underneath, in a corner, were fowling piece, musket, and matchlock. Short of stature he was, but strongly built and athletic, broad in the shoulders, deep-chested, with muscles and sinews of iron. Brown as a nut was his face, but his russet beard was already flaked with patches of snow, as hedges sometimes in November. Near him was seated John Alden, his friend and household companion, writing with diligent speed at a table of pine by the window, fair-haired, azure-eyed, with delicate Saxon complexion, having the dew of his youth and the beauty thereof, as the captives whom St. Gregory saw and exclaimed, "Not angels, but angels." Youngest of all was he of the men who came in the Mayflower. Suddenly, breaking the silence, the diligent scribe interrupting, spake in the pride of his heart Miles Standish, the captain of Plymouth. "Look at these arms," he said, "the warlike weapons that hang here, burnished and bright and clean, as if for parade or inspection. This is the sword of Damascus I fought with in Flanders. This breastplate, well I remember the day, once saved my life in a skirmish. Here in the front you can see the very dint of the bullet fired point blank at my heart by a Spanish arcabuero. Had it not been of sheer steel, the forgotten bones of Miles Standish at this moment would be mould in their grave in the Flemish morasses." Thereupon answered John Alden, but looked not up from his writing. "Truly the breath of the Lord hath slackened the speed of the bullet. He in his mercy preserved you, to be our shield and our weapon." Still, the captain continued, unheeding the words of the stripling. "See how bright they are burnished, as if in an arsenal hanging. That is because I have done it myself, and not left it to others. Serve yourself, would you be well served, is an excellent adage. So I take care of my arms, as you of your pens and inkhorn. Then, too, there are my soldiers, my great invincible army. 12 men, all equipped, having each his rest and his matchlock, 18 shillings a month, together with diet and pillage, and like Caesar, I know the name of each of my soldiers." This he said with a smile that danced in his eyes as sunbeams dance on the waves of the sea and vanish again in a moment. Alden laughed as he wrote, and still the captain continued, "Look, you can see from this window my brazen howitzer planted high on the roof of the church, a preacher who speaks to the purpose, steady, straightforward, and strong, with irresistible logic, orthodox, flashing conviction right to the hearts of the heathen. Now we are ready, I think, for any assault of the Indians. Let them come, if they like, and the sooner they try it, the better. Let them come, if they like, be it Sagamore, Sachem, or Powwow, Aspinet, Samoset, Corbitant, Squanto, or Takamama Haman." Long at the window he stood, and wistfully gazed on the landscape, washed with a cold gray mist, the vapory breath of the east wind, forest and meadow and hill, and the steel blue rim of the ocean lying silent and sad in the afternoon shadows and sunshine. Over his countenance flitted a shadow like those on the landscape, gloom intermingled with light, and his voice was subdued with emotion, tenderness, pity, regret, as after a pause he proceeded, "Yonder there, on the hill by the sea, lies buried Rose Standish, beautiful rose of love that bloomed for me by the wayside. She was the first to die of all who came in the Mayflower. Green above her is growing the field of wheat we have sown there. Better to hide from the Indian scouts the graves of our people, lest they should count them and see how many already have perished." Sadly his face he averted, and strode up and down, and was thoughtful. Fixed on the opposite wall was a shelf of books, and among them prominent 3, distinguished alike for bulk and binding: Barrett's Artillery Guide, and the Commentaries of Caesar, out of the Latin, translated by Arthur Goldinge of London, and, as if guarded by these, between them was standing the Bible. Musing a moment before them, Miles Standish paused, as if doubtful which of the three he should choose for his consolation and comfort, whether the wars of the Hebrews, the famous campaigns of the Romans, or the artillery practice designed for belligerent Christians. Finally, down from its shelf, he dragged the ponderous Roman, seated himself at the window, and opened the book, and in silence turned o'er the well-worn leaves where the thumb marks, thick on the margin like the trample of feet, proclaimed the battle was hottest. Nothing was heard in the room but the hurrying pen of the stripling, busily writing epistles important, to go by the Mayflower, ready to sail on the morrow, or the next day at least, God willing, homeward bound with tidings of all that terrible winter, letters written by Alden, and full of the name Priscilla, full of the name and the fame of the Puritan maiden, Priscilla. That's the end of section 1. Aren't you curious who Priscilla is? I can't wait to find out. See you next time.